guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched The Flash. Let's talk about it. So The Flash is directed by Andy Muschietti. Now, this film has been in development for approximately 17 decades. Like this film has been through a lot. It's been through 50 different directors, 170 different writers. It's seen regime changes from the world, but also within Warner Brothers itself. Like, this film has been through it, okay? It has seen some things, and you might think, you know, after all of the drama, the controversies, the criminal charges, you might think that it would have all been worth it to finally see this film that has a $200 million plus budget, okay? But instead, it was not worth it. I can most definitely say from my chest that this film was not worth the hassle because it was a colossal disaster, in my humble opinion. Yes, I'm going to be discussing my thoughts on The Flash in this video, and spoiler alert, my thoughts aren't too favorable about this film. So if you happen to be a fan of the film, that might irk you a little bit, and I understand, that's fine. There's plenty of other reviews that you can check out on my channel, okay? Have a great day, and if you're happy to hear my thoughts regardless, then thank you and welcome. Put up a chair. Before we dive into said thoughts though, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado guys, let's dive into the best superhero movie since The Dark Knight. And I think that's where I'm going to start my review. I'm going to briefly talk about the advertising campaign for this film, which ended up being quite unconventional because of the controversies and problematic aspects that this film found itself dealing with, in the form of Ezra Miller's antics, in the form of the many regime changes, okay? Like I said, this film has been through a lot. And so Warner Brothers' solution to deal with this was to have a bizarre marketing campaign where you had a bunch of celebrities like Tom Cruise and Stephen King kind of vouch for this film and say, you know, they had seen it from the comfort of their home cinemas and they could reassure us that this film was one of the greatest superhero films ever made. Don't worry guys, it's worth your, you know, £10 to go see this film in the cinema because it's just mwah. It's just exactly what we need in cinema, as Tom Cruise said verbatim, okay? Like, these people were really vouching for this film, going hard for this film, and so it was building up anticipation and expectations from fans and naysayers before its release. Not to mention, they had another tactic where they were showing this film to a bunch of people months in advance at CinemaCon, at various different events, just to try and build up that word of mouth. But that ended up spluttering out. You know, some people said they really enjoyed it. A lot of people called the film uneven, and so all of these tactics didn't quite work, and instead ended up making liars out of these celebrities, especially because, you know, this film was bound to come out for real at some point, and we were all going to see the truth for our very eyes. And let me tell you, when I sat down on Wednesday in my seat in the cinema, okay, in View Cinema, to see this thing, I could not believe my eyes because I can tell you right here, right now, this is not, okay, spoiler alert, this is not the best superhero film to come out since The Dark Knight. It's not even the best DC film to have come out since The Dark Knight. It's not even the best superhero film to have come out this year. It's not even the best superhero film to have come out this month. This is ridiculous. So we are going to dive into my thoughts on this movie. I'm going to put my hair up because it's so hot. First off, let's start off with the story, as I usually do. So here we have the return of Ezra Miller's Flash, and this is his first solo outing, which I think it was a mistake, you know, considering the storyline that's explored here, the Flashpoint storyline from the comics. I think that was the wrong story to go with for his very first solo outing. But considering all of the drama and the antics, you know, surrounding this movie, I do think that Flashpoint was pretty much the, you know, only solution to so many of these problems. But yes, so basically we have a retelling of the Flashpoint storyline, which I never read from the comics, but I did see on the CW Flash series. We'll talk about that later. At the beginning of this film, we just see the Flash kind of doing his thing. He's apparently cleaning up a lot of Batman's messes, running through the streets of Gotham City, saving some horribly CGI rendered babies. Saving some babies, popping babies in microwaves, guys. Oh, we will talk about the CG in this film from 2023. But anyway, and then he goes back to work as a forensic scientist in the city of London, because that's where they are. Because that's where they clear it. Listen, as a Londoner, you guys know I love seeing my city pop up in these films and TV shows. But there was something about it here that was just grating, because I was like, you know, the sites that they were using weren't even juicy, they weren't even interesting. Parts of this film were also filmed in Glasgow, and I'm not a native Glasgowian. I'm not from Glasgow. I only went once, okay, and that was shortly after they were filming The Batman. And so, you know, when I did my review of The Batman, I was excited to see Glasgow depicted in that way, the way that Matt Reeves had recreated Gotham using sites in Glasgow and Liverpool. Whereas here, like, there was just no recreation, there was no imagination. I've walked past Smithfield Market so many times and it was depicted exactly as I see it on horrible rainy mornings. You know, I've walked past Finsbury Square so many times, and like there was just one shot of this like yellow Toyota that just like ran past the street, and I was like, is that supposed to be some American city? Because I know Finsbury Square when I see it. It just wasn't imaginative, it wasn't creative. But yeah, Barry Allen happens to work in, I believe, the City of London University, which is funny because recently I was talking about You season 4, which used the V&A Museum as a university, and now here a university is being used as Barry's workplace. But one of Barry's main motivations for working in the police department in the first place is of course because of his backstory, where his father was wrongfully convicted of murdering his mother after his mother was killed by a mysterious force, and he ended up, you know, coming home and holding the murder weapon in his hand, therefore making it look like he was the one who actually committed the crime. And so Barry has been working hard pretty much all his life since then, trying to prove his father's innocence, and that's kind of why he got into the field of, you know, forensic sciences and all of that. And he's also been working on side projects on his own time to figure out a way to prove his father's innocence and get him, you know, out of prison. And we actually get the sequence depicting these events early on in the film when Barry is kind of taking a look at some new footage of his father in the store where he was supposed to pick up the tomato soup, but his father didn't look up at the security cameras, and so it was hard to determine if it was really him at the store at the time when his mother had been killed. And so Barry's kind of reviewing this new evidence, but also, you know, thinking back to that event that happened that was obviously very traumatizing. And I think, you know, the way that the trailers portrayed it, it made it look like he actually travels back in time and sees what happened to his parents. I think that's what happened in the CW version as well, and I preferred that interpretation versus this one where it was just a sudden, you know, flip to, you know, the flashback. That it wasn't really as smooth in terms of incorporating the flashback sequences to the present day sequences, and we saw a good example of doing such in the form of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, where there are quite a few flashbacks to Rocket's backstory, and I think it was done better there. But here it just felt really jarring. But that's just a small note. I mean, that's the least of this film's problems. Okay, but we're going through the story, and I'm going to mention the stuff that I found a little bit troubling along the way, as well as some of the good stuff that I enjoyed. So just stick with me. Anyways, when we return to the present day, we see Barry running furiously, faster than ever before, because he's driven by these emotions, and he finds himself, I guess, like in the Speed Force somehow. somehow this is kind of an entity that he's never you know, come across before, but he's kind of hit new heights in his speed, and he's broken the sound barrier or the speed of light or something. And that's always been a big theme with the Flash overall. One of the reasons why I stopped watching the CW series is because I got sick and tired of the main motive of the character just being running faster. It's like, I'm not fast enough, I'm not strong enough, I gotta run faster, I gotta keep running faster. Like, that's literally all that the Flash is, and it's so annoying. But yeah, so Barry runs super fast and he ends up in the Speed Force somehow, and he realizes that this is a point between space and time, and perhaps he's able to go back in time within this entity. And that's exactly what happens. He manages to go back in time to when he was saving the babies, okay, the CGI babies and the dog, and he sees himself doing it. And that's when he realizes that he has the power to travel through time if he is able to run fast enough. Then Barry quickly comes to the conclusion that he absolutely needs to find a way to save his mother from dying. And so he's kind of thinking about this. He poses the question to Batman, who's like, nah, this is a bad idea. And by the way, Ben Affleck's Batman is the Batman in question at this point. It was nice to see him back. I've never been a big fan of Ben Affleck's Batman though, so I wasn't like gunning to see him again. But if this is going to be the final note of the character in this franchise, then I think he had a decent outing. Although I really hated his suit in this film as well. I'm trying not to be a hater, but man, that suit was ugly. He's always looked bad in my opinion. I've never liked any of the suits that he's worn, even across the Snyder films. I have to say, even then, this is one of the worst suits that we've seen him in, with like the see-through plastic that had holes in it. Like, it was not giving. Then Barry stumbles across Iris once again. He met her earlier in the film, and by the way, I found Iris to be quite unlikable and mean when we first meet her in the film, because she's kind of, you know, trying to dig into Barry's mind and see how he feels about his father having an arraignment. I think it's the next day, and it was just like, sis, like, you're claiming to be a friend, but you're also a reporter. Like, what's going on? Like, clearly she wanted an inside scoop into what the Sun thinks about all of this. It was just like, yeah, it didn't sit right with me, and they didn't have any connection in my opinion. Like, they didn't have any romantic chemistry. Basically what I'm saying is that they have nothing on the Iris and Barry from the CW show, because that's connection, that's romantic chemistry. Okay, I haven't watched that show in a long time, but I remember that much. We're reintroduced to the character when she shows up on the street, and Barry invites her into his flat, which he quickly cleans up. I thought that was cute and funny. And you know, they discuss, you know, hypothetically, if Iris had the chance, would she go back in time and, you know, save someone? And obviously Barry is talking about a real life possibility of him doing that using the Speed Force, and something that she says drives him to do what he wanted to do in the first place. I don't think her advice necessarily pointed him in that direction, but he is basically already made up his mind that he wants to save his mum, so there's nothing really that was going to stop him. Barry goes back into the Speed Force, you know, attempting to save his mother in the past, but he's knocked out of the Speed Force by some kind of monstrous being, I thought it was like a reverse Flash situation, but we'll learn that's not the case. And so he ends up in 2013, 10 years prior, and he comes across a version of his mother who has raised another version of him, and he quickly meets that other version who's much younger and hasn't gotten his powers yet, and it just so happens that that version is going to be getting his powers very soon. And so they go off and figure out how to get other Barry, younger Barry's powers, to make sure that older Barry also gets his powers. I don't understand. I mean, I've said this before. It's actually been a very long time since I've said this, so I'm back. Okay, hi, this is Jean, and this is the Jean that doesn't believe in time travel. I said this before time and time again. Time travel doesn't make sense. it doesn't make sense. I actually like the concept of the multiverse where you're creating branches, because then it's a whole different reality and you don't have to try and connect what happened in the past with the present, because then it creates this conundrum or this paradox. So I actually like the concept of a multiverse, but here they try to have their cake and eat it too, because later we'll see, okay, Batman, another version of Batman, point out that time travel doesn't work the way that some films may have taught you. Looking at you, Endgame. Time travel doesn't work that way, but instead it creates this like X point or something, this divergent point or whatever. But it doesn't make sense because Barry, or older Barry, wants younger Barry to get his powers on a certain day, and he's assuming that if younger Barry if younger Barry doesn't get his powers on that day, then older Barry would have never gotten his powers. But older Barry is not the same as younger Barry because he's from an alternate timeline where his mother died when he was younger. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I don't think anything that younger Barry does actually affects older Barry because they're not from the same timeline. In my mind, they're from another universe. So they're not actually connected to one another. Do you see what I mean? This is where I'm struggling. They go back to the Central City Police Department where older Barry, got his powers the first time around. And they aim to basically douse younger Barry with chemicals. This superhero stuff. They want to douse him with chemicals, and then just as lightning will strike, Barry will have the chemicals and the lightning in his body, and that will trigger his powers. Except something goes wrong and older Barry loses his powers, and younger Barry, you know, gets those powers, and he ends up being the Flash and has that moment of, oh my god, I have superpowers now. It's at this point that I should say I was having a decent time during these scenes, you know, seeing the two different versions of Barry interacting with one another. I liked this kind of Back to the Future approach that the film had. I think it was charming and endearing, and I think Ezra Miller did a good job in portraying both versions of the character for the most part. We'll talk about it more when we get to the character section, but I do think that there were some inconsistencies with the way that they portrayed the older version of Barry, because there were times when the character was overtly like on the spectrum, and there seemed to be some kind of neurodivergence in the character, whereas there were other times where that was far less apparent. So I do think that there was a little bit of inconsistency in the performance on that front, but I do think that when they were acting alongside themselves or rather using a double, it was really effective, because even though these two characters obviously look the same, they definitely felt like two distinct characters and two different versions of Barry Allen. I think what I struggled with when it came to this part of the story is that this story overall has several moments where things are just kind of kicking off. Like, it has several moments where we're just kind of going down the runway and not really taking flight. Do you know what I mean? It was like, okay, so we have this scene where younger Barry is learning how to use his powers, and he's discovering what it means to be the Flash and how to put on the suit, and it's all great and fun and funny. But then we have another scene where we have to meet a new sort of character that will be a part of the team, and then there's another scene where we have to break out another character from prison, and they're going to be a part of the team. Like, there's a lot of just like going through this runway, funnily enough, because he's a Flash. He's kind of slowly going through this runway, and then the film kind of just takes off at the end, and at that point it's just really disappointing, and it doesn't seem worth all of the hassle that we went through. And speaking of gaining new team members, at one point older Barry realizes that he is in an alternate reality. I don't think he's in a different universe. Again, this is very confusing. He's not in a different universe, but the fact that his mother did not die when she was supposed to means that some other things have changed, both in the future and in the past, whatever. And so basically there's a different Batman. Okay, Michael J. Fox is not in Back to the Future, and there's a different Batman. And this becomes extremely important information when we see Zod trying to take over Earth as he does in Man of Steel. And so Zod arrives, and Barry has memories of what that happened, and he had first gotten his powers and wasn't able to save many people. He can only save one child, but this time around he wants to do it right, and so he wants to gather the Justice League, except he discovers that the Justice League doesn't exist in this reality, and so he's going to have to come up with a plan B. And so in comes Batman, except it's not Ben Affleck's Batman. No, it's Michael Keaton's Batman. And this is when the film gets good. I have to say, guys, I was a fan of Michael Keaton's Batman, truly. Every time I saw him on screen, I was like, oh, thank goodness. Oh, thank finally something worth seeing. Finally something worth the price of admission and my trip to the cinema. Yes, yes. I only became a fan of Batman overall, but also Michael Keaton's Batman last year. I think it was last year, right? That's when The Batman came out. And I did, you know, my ranking video of all of the live action Batman movies. And I had watched, you know, Michael Keaton's Batman films for the first time in preparation for that video. So I actually became quite a fan of the character and all of his different iterations, with Ben Affleck being dead last. I was really excited to see Michael Keaton's iteration of the character make a reappearance after what, like 30 years in this film. I wasn't as excited as the hype for like No Way Home. I don't think Warner Brothers succeeded in making it quite as much of an event as No Way Home was. No Way Home was just on a different level, and this was just like a nice little add-on. You finally get introduced to him, and that's when he explains the concept of time travel as it really is, and not the version that you saw in Avengers Endgame, wink wink. It was so cringe when he said that. He was like, some movies may have told you that it's like this, and he literally uses the spaghetti to depict what the Ancient One had done in Avengers Endgame when she was talking to Bruce Banner, and I was like, that's unnecessary. Like, we didn't have to. The two Barrys are a little less concerned about how time travel works and more concerned about the fact that Zod is going to be invading, you know, the Earth in a matter of days, and so they need to figure out a way to stop him, and they decide to involve Superman. They're like, oh, where there's Batman, there'll be Superman. Like, where is this guy? And so Batman, using his famous detective skills, manages to find Superman, and they go to this like Siberian prison where this Superman is allegedly locked up, only to find out that it's not Superman at all, it's Kara, a Supergirl. So Supergirl ends up escaping in this glorious, heavily CG action sequence that looks pretty cool. It looks pretty decent for the most part, although again, the CG throughout this film is just so insane, so crazy. That parts of it also look really dodgy, but she manages to get away from, you know, the Serbians, Russians, whoever it was that had captured her, and so she is of no help to the team, so they have to regroup and figure out a way to get Ultra Flash his powers again. And they ultimately decide to do this like makeshift redo of the events that led to him getting his powers in the first place, where they pour a bunch of chemicals on him and then lightning is supposed to strike him, and that was just like so you have Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne just being like, kid, you're crazy, and like it's supposed to be funny, but Barry is like bleeding at the mouth, like he's literally dying and is played up for laughs. Like, this film is so bizarre. And then along comes Kara out of nowhere, and she just seems to know exactly what to do to get Barry his powers, because she's like, oh, I see you guys have set up this makeshift lab situation, but don't worry, I got you, boo. So she picks him up bridal style and heads straight to, you know, the tippity top of the Earth's atmosphere, where Barry is just able to breathe and relax and be fine. And then she manages to get him struck by lightning, like straight from the source, and he gets his powers again, and nothing has changed. It's just those exact same powers, even though it's in a completely different method, but whatever. And so now we have two Flashes, a Supergirl and a Batman, ready to take on Zod. And in terms of General Zod, he's back here portrayed by Michael Shannon in what I presume was a role that he carried out from the comfort of his own sofa in his own living room. Like, you can't convince me otherwise. Like, I fully believe that Michael Shannon was sitting down chilling in his settee, and he had like a makeshift sort of studio set, and he just had a mic in front of him and he just blathered on nonsense. It was just such a throwaway role. It was nothing, honestly. It was worse than his appearance in Man of Steel, which is actually quite decent and compelling and really threatening as a Superman villain. Here, he's just like, I mean, it could have been anyone. It's just sort of like a cardboard cutout version of a DC villain, and it just was not compelling in the slightest. So it's a good thing then that he didn't end up being the ultimate villain of this film, because that role was left for Barry himself, which is some interesting commentary on Ezra Miller, but we're not gonna go there. But it turns out that that evil figure that we saw earlier on that pushed Barry out of the Speed Force was actually Barry himself, because he can get over the fact that Supergirl died, because he was in love with her, because he cared about her, because they had a whole backstory that we didn't see somehow. I don't know what his fascination was with her. We'll talk about that in a second as well. But either way, he became obsessed with trying to go back in time and fix her and Batman's death during this battle sequence. And so that's what led to him becoming this like monstrous speedster that resided in the Speed Force, and ended up pushing Barry out of there when he wanted to go back in time to save his mother. Now, I have to say, with all of the faults and flaws that this story had overall, I actually liked that twist. I thought it was really compelling. I guessed it like about 5 or 10 minutes before it was revealed, but I still liked it. I still thought it was a really clever twist, and it was also really sad to see this like younger version of Barry who was just kind of happy to have his powers and was discovering how to be the Flash and excited about being a part of this, you know, superhero team, and all of a sudden he just became just so possessed and obsessed with trying to fix the past, and he was doomed to just go back in time over and over again, adding all of these different bits and pieces of armor to him as he went back each time. Like, there was something really sad and tragic about that, and I just wish, like, if it had just been a better execution, if that story had been told just a million times better, then it just would have really hit home. But there was so much else going on that did not work, that unfortunately that story wasn't as effective as it could have been. He's trying to prevent chaos from happening, and so he makes the mature but difficult decision to go back in time and allow the death of his mother, whilst also making a tiny tweak to at least save his father from having to suffer any more years in prison. And I think that was a decent compromise, and I think that was a somewhat, you know, bittersweet but happy ending for the character of Barry, because he learned a really valuable lesson that he could have learned had he just listened to Batman the first time, but whatever. And good on him. He managed to sort everything out. There were no long-term consequences. Done, dusted, ready to go to the next mission. Oh, what's this? George Clooney. Okay, so I've gone through the whole story, and just to add on to my overall thoughts, like I said, I thought the most compelling part of this story was that twist that, you know, evil Flash or the evil speedster ended up being Barry. But for the most part, I thought the story was really weak. I just felt like it was really disappointing, especially considering there were about a million different writers on this film. You would have thought that there would be some gold in there somewhere, or maybe that's the problem. Maybe there were just too many cooks in the kitchen to make anything edible. But ultimately this story just ended up being really lackluster, really confused, and it just wasn't able to stand on its own. And the storyline that really should have been the central focus of this entire film was butchered, in my opinion. I think this story would have been so much more effective if, you know, younger Barry that goes evil, was actually trying to save their mother. and not Supergirl for some random reason. Like, if he had actually been trying to say, okay, walk with me here, walk with me, right? First of all, if this final action sequence against Zod had actually taken place in the city rather than in some random landing where there weren't any people, there was no civilization except the US Army that was fighting back against Batman, you know, if there were actual stakes here, like in Man of Steel, where we saw some actual damage and people actually being in danger, then it would have been more effective, period, right? But if we had also seen Barry's mother put in a position of danger, and then you see younger Barry trying to save his mother, especially with the added pressure of knowing that older Barry's mother had died, right? If we saw him try to save his mother and fail, and then he loses it and becomes obsessed with trying to save her, failing each time until he turns into the evil speedster, that would have made more sense to me. Like, I don't know why they didn't go down that route. Instead, he was trying to save Batman and Supergirl because he had a crush on her on something, and it was so weird because that's not the through line that they were clearly trying to set up earlier on. It felt like they very much lost the plot. And another thing I wanted to talk about regarding this story was the tone of this film, because it's very bizarre to me. This film is surprisingly goofy, which I never would have guessed, not from the trailers, not from the synopsis. And I should have known, you know, in the first 5 minutes when Barry is saving a bunch of babies and puts one in a microwave, I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, hang on. This is not what I thought it was. When he puts that baby in a microwave, I knew that we weren't being serious. Like, I knew that we were going in a different route, and that's okay if you're able to deliver on the comedy, if the film is funny, if you're able to deliver on that tone, you know, consistently, then that's fine. But I feel like for the storyline, for the subject matters that are explored here, like the death of Barry's mother, like perhaps his mental illness and his neurodivergence, like the stuff that they kind of lay the groundwork for, it doesn't really match the goofy Looney Tunes nature of some of these comedic sequences. Like, it's just a very bizarre mismatch, and the tone is just really uneven throughout the film, which is jarring. And speaking of things that really did not work for me in this film, we have to talk about it. Before we dive into the characters, guys, I can't go any further into this review without mentioning the horrific CGI. Wow. wow. And I don't even know what to say, because I just couldn't believe it. I watched this film with my brother, and there were times when we would just look at each other and he would just say, like, I don't know. He would be like, don't look at me. Like, we were actually baffled. Like, we were so confused. At one point, I literally sat and thought, am I watching the right film? Like, is this the right theatre? Is this a parody of the film that I'm supposed to be watching? Like, I'm so confused by how terrible this film looked. The action sequences looked awful. The babies, awful. A lot of the sequences looked like CG models. Like, it looked like what you would prepare at the beginning of post-production. Surely not the end product. Surely not what you expect people to pay £15 for a cinema ticket for. Like, surely not that. And I'm sorry, there are so many people who are like, oh, I really enjoyed it. It was so fun. It was so great. Yeah, the CG was bad, but it was still a good film. Guys, for how CG heavy this film is, I simply could not enjoy it considering how terrible the CG was. I'm sorry, but I just could not forgive this. I remember when there were a bunch of people who said that they hated Black Panther. They said that they hated Black Panther. It was unwatchable because of the action sequence in the third act that had terrible CGI. I remember when people were saying that, and I was like, how can you dismiss the entirety of the film based off of some dodgy CG in the third act? That literally makes no sense. And in that case, I could forgive that film because the rest of what it had accomplished was so excellent. It was so brilliant that yes, this unfortunate turn in the third act was, you know, less than desirable, but still manageable to watch in terms of the full product. But here, in this case, the terrible CG is present in every single scene. It's so clear when you have the actual Ezra Miller acting in a scene versus their body double, because the body double's CG would just be horrible. Like it's terribly rendered. I can't believe this was the final product. So overall, it was just inescapable and it kept taking me out of the film. I could not enjoy this movie because of how awful it looked. And it wasn't just the way that things were rendered that was the problem. It was also the actual design of some of these set pieces, especially the Speed Force. The Speed Force, aka the bowl of CGI cereal, as my brother referred to it. The Speed Force to me was so hideous. The way that they designed it to look all splodgy and gummy. I refer to them as gummy bears. They looked all gummy and rubbery, unrealistically smooth and like it was just awful. Terrible. It was just one of the worst designs that I've ever seen for, you know, an alternate reality or realm or anything like that. Like I was giving Quantumania a bad time. I was dragging Quantumania left and right because of its very noticeable use of the volume. But I would have taken the volume any day of the week if this was the alternative. And for the record, I did recently see that Andy Muschietti was trying to defend this creative decision by saying that the Speed Force is supposed to look distorted and weird because that's how the human eye perceives it, as someone who is not a speedster. That's kind of what he was going for intentionally, blah, blah, blah. Andy, my friend, Andy, come to Jean, come to Auntie Jean. Andy, please sit down. Please sit down. Sir, either you are BSing real hard right now, like either you are just lying through your teeth, just like Tom Cruise was about this film, or you actually did this intentionally, in which case that is terrifying. In which case, DC may have an even bigger problem than anticipated when they hired you for Batman Brave and the Bold. Okay, so now let's do a speedy run through the characters, starting off with the titular character himself, Barry Allen, aka The Flash. I was never really the biggest fan of Ezra Miller's The Flash. I thought he was a bit of a goofy, underdeveloped character who had some really cringeworthy jokes in the Justice League. I think it's so stupid that people call it that, but anyways, the Justice League. He had some really cringe jokes that were very reminiscent of some of the, you know, less successful jokes in Avengers Age of Ultron, thanks Joss Whedon. Anywho, also, I just strongly dislike the way that he runs. I'm sorry. I think it looks goofy as hell. And they tried to make it all artistic this time around by showing his like process and showing how he does a bit of this. I didn't find it convincing. I still thought it looked goofy as hell. I wasn't a fan. I did think it was interesting that they introduced the idea that Barry may be neurodivergent in some ways, perhaps on the spectrum, because of the way Ezra Miller portrayed him in this film, especially the older version of Barry. So yeah, that was an interesting turn, but like I said earlier, that was quite inconsistent throughout the film. And even still, I have to say, the film never explicitly mentions whether or not Barry is on the spectrum. This is just like our interpretation as viewers, and I think that's a bit of a cop-out on the film's part. I think, you know, as I said before, Flashpoint wasn't the ideal story to start off Barry's solo journey in the DCU. I think it would have made more sense to have a more introductory solo film first, so that we could get to know the character a bit better, because up until now he's only had appearances in group movies. So I think, you know, getting to know the character as an individual first of all would have been beneficial, so then we could have clarified whether or not he's actually on the spectrum and if that's a part of his story. Whereas now we're just kind of guessing it based off of Ezra Miller's performance, and I don't know, I think, like I said, it's a bit of a cop-out. I'm sure there are a bunch of people who could relate to this, you know, neurodivergence, people who are on the spectrum who would have loved to see that representation, but it's just so vague and something that is not commented on in the film that I don't think it counts as a win. Now, Ezra Miller actually portrayed portrays 3 different versions of Barry Allen in this film. They also portray younger Barry, who is, you know, sweet, he's cute, especially when he's excited about getting his powers, and so it makes it even more, you know, sad and tragic when he ends up going down that dark path, although I think my retcon of the story is a lot better than the one that we got. But I do think that it did hit home more because of how innocent and happy-go-lucky he was previously, before older Barry came into his life. But I do think that the switch from him, you know, being, you know, cute younger Barry to evil dark Flash was just too sudden to be convincing. Again, like, the story was there, the idea was there, but the execution was lacking. And then next up we have my favorite character of this entire motion picture, and that is Michael Keaton. Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne, aka Batman. Like I said, I just smiled every time I saw him on screen. Like, he actually saved this film for me. He made it watchable. I was actually invested in his character. I'm choosing to believe that he's not dead. I'm choosing to believe that that end scene where he dies is just nonsense. I'm retconning it in my head. Like, that is not my head canon. I do not accept this, because I'm choosing to believe that he could show up again in the future. You know, some other version of him, perhaps. I don't know, but we need Michael Keaton to come back. He can't go off like this. This can't be the last stand. Like, this can't be it, okay? Anywho, my point was Michael Keaton wasn't the problem. Okay, he wasn't at fault here. Another person who wasn't the problem was Sasha Calle, who portrays Kara, aka Supergirl. I really liked Supergirl. I was a fan of Supergirl. Oh, I want to see her return for sure. I think James Gunn can do something really great with this character. He doesn't need to direct. Okay, I know he's already directing Superman. He doesn't need to direct all of the new DC films, please. Okay, but I think he should get someone else, okay, to direct a Supergirl movie, and it should star Sasha Calle. I know that they have another Supergirl or Superwoman movie in the works, but whatever it is, it needs to be centered on Sasha Calle's character because she is phenomenal. Her look was so striking, even though she looked like she was related to Ezra Miller, but it's fine. She had the same haircut as younger Barry, which was a little distracting, but the haircut worked on her so much better. It was such a cool look, and at first I didn't like her suit because I felt like it needed more red on the bottom half. I still do, to be fair. I think it needs like red boots or something. It's just odd how it's like red here and then just blue throughout. Like, it needs something else to cut through. But anyways, she looked great. She looked absolutely fantastic. I loved her demeanor. It made sense for where she was at, you know, at that point of the story. I just loved her characterization of Supergirl. She was such a cool character, great casting, and it's just a shame that she was stuck in this travesty of a film. And that's pretty much all of the main characters, which leaves me with the cameos. Let's talk about the cameos. Everyone wants to be Spider-Man No Way Home, it seems, and so everyone is, you know, trying their hand at these multiversal cameos, using these, you know, legendary historic versions of very popular superheroes, and this film is no different. During the end action sequence in particular, where it's taking place in the Speed Force and the universes are crashing and everything is falling to crap, you get these random cameos of like Christopher Reeve's Superman, Nicolas Cage's Superman, which was never actually a thing, but it was in development for a while. You get a quick cameo of Henry Cavill's Superman as well, who looks awful with this CG, as do the rest. Okay, everything just looks so bad. I must reiterate this. And then you get this quick cameo of Jay Garrett, I believe it was, the different version of the Flash that actually often made an appearance in the CW Flash series. Overall, I mean, I'm sure people who have like a nostalgic attachment to these versions of the character must have been excited to see them pop up, but to me it was just like such a throwaway thing. Like, the way that it was materialized was awful with that goddamn terrible CG, and then their roles were just so throwaway. Like, they didn't actually play an active part in the story. Like, they didn't even speak. Like, it was was just a museum of cameos, basically, like just quick appearances that were meaningless and just nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. And again, if you have an emotional connection to those versions of the characters, then maybe you really felt something and were excited by these appearances. But to me, the combination of just how awful they looked and how nonsensical it was for the story made it really unappealing. And not to mention, if I was going to be invested in any cameo in this film, just one single cameo that I actually wanted to freaking see, it wouldn't be all of these Supermen, it wouldn't be all of these Batmen, it would be the most popular version of the Flash that we have gotten in the last decade. Where was Grant Gustin? Where was Grant Gustin? It's wild to me that they went through the effort of bringing Christopher Reeves back from the dead. Literally, okay, resurrecting Christopher Reeves through terrible CGI instead of just picking up the phone and giving Grant Gustin a call. They probably wouldn't have even needed to call him, actually. They have so much stock footage of this guy running from the CW show that ran for literally 10 years that they could have just used any scene, any one scene from that show. And instead they went for the effort of bringing Nicolas Cage as Superman, which never materialized, and probably only like 10 people who are really into the Superman lore would know about, right, would get that reference. Mainstream audiences won't even understand that, right? And then they got Christopher Reeve Superman, this poor man, R.I.P., will never rest, okay, under this franchise. All of this instead of just getting the most iconic, popular version of the Flash that we have gotten in a decade, in Grant Gustin. Like, it just boggles my mind. Like, it really just annoyed me. And I'd heard that he wasn't in this film. I'd heard that he hadn't gotten the call. But even when I was sitting in the cinema, I just had that glimmer of hope of like, maybe it was a lie. Maybe he was doing an Andrew Garfield. Like, who knows? But no, they genuinely made the horrendous error of excluding Grant Gustin's Flash from this Flash movie. Like, it's just... maybe they were threatened. Maybe they understood. Maybe they knew that Grant Gustin's Flash is so far superior that Ezra Miller's Flash was just pale in comparison. And they didn't want to do that to this version of Barry Allen in his own film. Maybe that's what they were going for, okay? I hope. I would rather it be envy than stupidity. So I'm hoping that's what they were going for. I think that James Gunn right now just needs to focus on making his Superman the actual best superhero film since The Dark Knight, okay? That needs to be his focus right now. Instead of lying to people, okay, look at people dead in the eyes and lying to them about the existing DC slate, just focus on what you need to do, my guy, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, okay? But still, considering the fact that I recently rewatched Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 in cinemas and just reminded myself of how exceptional that film was, I do have hope that James Gunn can turn this train wreck around. But until he comes along, I suspect we're going to be going through more of these train wrecks in the near future for the rest of the 2023 DC slate. But in the meantime, with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving The Flash a 5 out of 10. So that's it from me, guys. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on The Flash, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this film down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching on this very hot day, on this very hot night. Okay, it's literally 2 a.m. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.